part this afternoon, the next 1 hour and a half that you will be spending with us. The first part, you'll get to know our speakers, our panelists, and they will take you through their perspective about cities taking climate action. That bit will be good. The second half will be brilliant. That's because the second half is you. That is for your questions, your Q&A that you would like to pose to our panel up here. So anything that you're thinking of, that you think, oh, I'd love to follow up there, that is your moment to be able to do that. So with this title, I'm curious about where you are right now, what you're thinking about right now. Cities take climate action. In that sentence, what is the most important word for you? Action. I heard an action. Anything? Everybody agree? Was that unilateral action? All right. I will make sure that we focus on the action part of our panel session. To get us started, set the scene so you can hear where we're coming from, I want to introduce you to Raf Tutz. He's the UN Habitat Coordinator of Urban Planning Design Branch at UN Habitat. Thank you very much, Raf.
Thanks, Femi, for the introductions, and also thanks to Cities Alliance for partnering with us to organize this event. Unfortunately, my boss, Juan Clos, cannot make it this afternoon. He had to rush unexpectedly to the city for an unexpected meeting, so he sends his regards and asked me to say a few words on behalf of Habitat. Actually, we're very happy as a UN agency for cities and urbanization to be in the lead together with Cities Alliance in this event. And it's very appropriate that it is with Cities Alliance because about 6 years ago, Cities Alliance supported one of the first joint work programs on cities and climate change, helping different organizations to come together. That was the World Bank, United Nations Environment Programme, and ourselves to coordinate our action on cities and climate change. So that was much appreciated, and I see this in a continuation of that spirit. And we have come a long way since 2009. For those ones who were with us at the City Hall on Friday, I mean, 400 mayors in such a special, very, very special event. I think we have reached the kind of summit of city action or city visibility, certainly in this conference of parties. And that's not a surprise, because cities are taking action. Cities are taking action on mitigation. We have seen recent very good examples, for instance, Cape Town linking mitigation with low-income housing and energy saving. We have seen Oslo leading the world in electric mobility. And also in adaptation, because that's necessary as well. We see Quito, where Habitat 3 will be held next year, has made a very significant program of relocating dwellers who are in vulnerable conditions. And big cities like Ho Chi Minh City are completely changing their urban development direction to respond to vulnerability, to severe vulnerability to climate change. So action is absolutely happening. And you can also see that from another event, the Compact of Mayors. There are some initiatives over the past years, and in fact we almost see one new initiative every month now, which are city-based, focusing on action, focusing on finance, focusing on measurement and on commitment. So there's a lot of work out there, a lot of commitment that needs to be further upscaled. Ourselves, Habitat, we are working both on a normative and also an operational level, and we have also worked with especially medium-sized cities in developing countries. For instance, we have worked with Maputo on creating a buffer, preserving mangrove forest. We have worked with communities in Senegal to protecting them from sea level rise, and in Kathmandu on urban agriculture, and in Kampala on flood prevention. So we are focusing on the mid-level cities. What we have seen through these experiences is there's an increasing understanding, an increasing need for more complex responses and for more integrated responses that link climate action to urban planning, and urban development per se. And we have just launched, actually 2 days ago, a new publication together with more than 40 organizations, many of whom are in this room, which is the guiding principles for city climate action plans, where we are identifying a number of principles which we feel are extremely important to make these city action plans meaningful. And I just want to list them for you, because I believe this is really one of the areas moving forward. The plans have to be ambitious. That means they should not just focus on the low-hanging fruits. They should really go much further. They need to be inclusive. They need to include everyone who is concerned with the action. They need to be fair. That means need to distribute the costs and to benefits equally over the society. They need to be integrated within the city, but also towards broader levels of government, from city to region and beyond. They need to be relevant, meaning touching on the co-benefits that matter for each specific city. Actionable, that means linking city plans, city climate plans with finance and with legislation. And they need to be evidence-based, and we have seen so many networks of urban researchers on climate change. And finally, they need to be transparent and verifiable. And the work of ICLE on carbon is an excellent leading example of that element of a good city action plan. So what is needed further as we move forward for the next 5 years? First of all, we feel that in the national commitments, the INDCs, there is still not enough explicit mention of cities and of subnational action. So I think we need to strengthen that for the next round and really have a much more closer interaction between cities and national governments at the national level to make this happen. Second, and this is now connecting to Habitat 3, we need to get a stronger climate change dimension in national urban policies. National urban policies is going to be one of the key deliverables at Habitat 3 in October in Quito, and we really believe that climate change should be one of the top elements that is fully integrated in these national urban policies, which implicitly means a distribution of resources between national, regional and local government to encourage climate action. So we have a big opportunity in Quito, a new urban agenda, a transformation of a new urban model, and I hope you'll all be there with us. And I believe that this group, this kind of follower of the Joint Work Program and the Cities Alliance can provide a very, very useful platform to stimulate this action. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Raf. So there's more than one way to have a conversation. There's the analog way, which is the way we're having it right now. And then there's the digital way, which is the way I love to have conversations, because that means that the whole world can listen in. A couple of hashtags if you're actually going to be tweeting and using hashtags. Hashtag climate action. Hashtag Habitat 3, that's the number 3. And obviously hashtag COP21. All right. Now to the analog conversation. So Parks Tao is sitting right here. Parks Tao, when you've been wandering around COP21 and you introduce yourself, how do you introduce yourself?
Well, I would say Parks Tao, Mayor of the City of Johannesburg. But in many ways, part of a network of cities that are taking action to mitigate climate change. A city that is active in a number of networks, C40, ICLE, and UCLG, that are active in the broader development programs, but most important, taking into account the platform that we're at, the actions that we're taking with regards to climate change in our respective cities. So one sees himself as part of a network of cities that are making practical contributions to both mitigation actions, but also adaptation in our cities.
That is some introduction. That's like 5 minutes of introduction. Thank you. It's great to have you here. Sitting next to Parks Tao is the Deputy Mayor of the city of Shimla in India. Deputy Mayor, I believe that's in the northwestern side of India.
Yeah.
Yes, and it's Tikender Panwa. So, Mayor Panwa, when people are introduced to you here, what do you tell them that you do?
Come again.
What do you tell them that you do when you are introduced here at COP21? I didn't realize it was going to be a real analog conversation.
Probably, this is a problem with technology these days. What do I do? I mean, it's very difficult for me to explain. But I come here as an eager watcher, and this is what I told in one of the conferences that was there in the Compact of Mayors, that yesterday I was roaming through the Eiffel Tower because yesterday it was Sunday, and I sent some of the pictures back home. They said, we've not sent you to watch Eiffel Tower, we've sent you to watch COP21. And I think this is what I do here, to watch COP21, not just what our national governments are doing, but also it reminds me that my people are watching me, what I'm doing here. I think that is for time to come what I'm doing here. Thank you.
Louise de Mello, please pick up a microphone. Deputy Director, Public Governor and Territorial Developments, OECD France. Did I get that right?
Yes,
Okay.
absolutely.
You spend a lot of time traveling, but why are you important in this particular conversation?
Very good. I know it's a long title with long words, but the translation of that very simply is that, what we do at the OECD is to connect local governments, regional governments, national governments, to share expertise, to share good practices in areas that span, public policies in general. But in terms of what we are doing here today, it's basically all the experience that we have with action to climate change. How do you deal with mitigation, with adaptation? How you deal with the way local governments go about their daily businesses in their different areas of policy with the objective of, in 50, 100 years from now, having a better planet.
Thank you so much. Anastasia, pick up a microphone. Very good. All right, Anastasia Waimana is from the Slum Dwellers International. Why are you so important in this conversation?
Thank you. I came here to advocate for the people who live in slums so that we may connect with the stakeholders and the NGOs and the local government for the betterment of the slum dwellers.
Thank you. Looking forward to hearing more from you. Henri de Cazot is the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Development Department, and he's also the French Special Rep for Habitat 3 right here in France. Great to have you here. Why are you so important in this conversation? Why are you critical?
Well, I don't know if I'm so important. I'm here first to represent my minister who couldn't make it, and I apologize for her absence. I am here because I was a negotiator for France for the SDGs and for financing for development. And I am now here to prepare Habitat 3 with all the parties. And I am saying that we have to build this sustainable development agenda where cities and urban development are going to play a major role. Habitat 3 will be an implementing rendezvous. And I am trying to help people who are all in this action agenda here at the COP. And you have almost 90 events around cities and urban development during the COP. Outside, inside, in the green zone, in the blue zone, and of course the wonderful event that we had at the mayor's office.
Good to have you here. Billy Cobbett is the director of the Cities Alliance in Belgium. Billy, this is a UN Habitat Cities Alliance conversation session. So why is it important for you to be here and be part of the conversation, as well as just being a partnership in it?
Thank you. Well, of course, first and foremost, to represent the Cities Alliance with our partners, UN Habitat. But this is a continuation of a long journey. The Cities Alliance is a partnership of 28 members.
Thank you.
No
Sorry,
worries.
this is why you should never talk to the moderator when she's moderating, unless you're up here on the stage. Sorry, Billy, go ahead.
Just starting. This is a continuation of a journey where we have been advocating for increased attention, not only on urban poverty and urban development, but on the role of cities in solving some of the world's global problems. And so COP21, as Henri just said, somewhat ironically, has the best representation of cities of any of the international conferences we've seen. And this is a huge change And we are here to keep pushing in that direction and keep supporting the role of cities.
All right, this is an unfair thing to ask you straight off the bat, but cities take climate action. What city comes to mind with that sentence? What one do you like, yes, either because they're not and they're in trouble, or they are and they're a role model?
Well, I would first and foremost say that, not to give you the answer you're looking for, climate action requires cities to do their core business properly. And so there's no particular magic. What we're looking for is cities that do their core business year after year in a way that has an impact. There's no separate box for dealing with climate action, which is separate from the mayor's other work. So I will then answer your question more directly and say, for example, cities that are planning ahead for the future and doing stuff now to stop 5 decades of fixing disasters afterwards are the cities we should be looking for as examples. And some of those would be, for example, secondary cities in Ethiopia are beginning to make that progress.
Louise, I see you nodding. Pick up the microphone. Articulate the nod.
Let me try to articulate the nod. Now, I think I agree that the cities are at the heart of this. And obviously, everything that they do, and cities around the world have very broad mandates, all of that has to do with taking action against climate change. Just to give you an idea, in the OECD area, on average, almost 2/3 of all the investment that takes place, not only related to climate, but all the investment that takes place is carried out at the local level. It's cities and local governments. We have globally in the world nowadays an urbanization rate of about over 50%. That will go up to 85% by the end of the century. So if you take the importance of cities as investors, the importance of cities where economic activity happens, where pollution happens. 80% of all the consumption of energy on average in our societies happens in cities. So cities are at the core of it. And if a mayor, a local authority, and we have 2 mayors here, so I have to be careful, please correct me. If mayors forget about taking action for climate change in their daily business, there will be an aspect of it that will be left behind.
But why? Because even places like Joburg and Shimla, maybe the impacts might not be felt long after they've been in office. So why should they care about taking climate action? Why should that be on their agenda?
Because we are talking about measures that will have an impact over a sustained period of time. It's not something that is done today and the impact will be felt today. We are talking about the long term. So nobody can afford, we can't afford inaction right now because the cost of inaction also accumulates over time. We are talking about the cumulative consequences of not doing anything or not dealing with climate change. If we don't get started, then it will be too late anyway. And it will be too late in areas where, I mentioned just the case of investment. Investment is about locking in solutions. It's about making choices now that will have, because of the sunk costs of investment, because of the role that investment plays in mitigation and adaptation, decisions that are taken now will influence what's going to happen decades from now. That's why you cannot afford to just ignore what happens beyond your term in office. The same goes for all of us, really. We cannot just think that what we do now will not have consequences for our children and so on. It's almost a cliche to say this, but this very long time dimension is what makes this problem so interesting, so challenging, and also so important to start taking action, to use the word that motivates this discussion now.
Sure. Anastasia, I want you to pick up the microphone because we're talking about money and financing here, and I don't want us to forget the constituents that you represent, which is the urban poor. Tell us what we should be remembering as we're having this conversation about where you work and that neighborhood. Tell me about the community that you work with.
Thank you. I work with Slum Dweller International, SDI, and back to our country we have groups which we do saving towards loaning ourselves and also attracting funds from the local government and also from the NGOs. We have done a lot with that money to elevate poverty within ourselves, and also we have done much with that money because we have constructed houses, also buying land to build for the spill out from our slums.
Thank you very much. I just want to, I'm going to keep going back to Anastasia so we just remember the breadth of our conversation. Henri, when we're talking about financing here, one of the things we wanted to do with this session was showcase the work of UN Habitat and also Cities Alliances, the partnerships that happen there. If you were going to do a humble brag and show off, what would you tell us that you've been doing?
Well, I think it's not just cities. We must build the alliance between the governments and the cities because we have the same targets. And for the international community to help the local urban development, they have to organize their structures to help build the structures that will do the work. France is very...
Structures like what?
Like-
I'm going to allow
Yes.
people to be general at the beginning, but
Well-
now we're getting deeper. So like what?
like National Housing Commission, finance banks, development banks, local development banks, and of course, when the municipalities have a strong balance sheet, you can fund directly the balance sheet. And in the future, you could have direct budgetary support, long-term budgetary support, because this climate agenda is a very long-term. We need to have a capacity to create the partnership, the international partnership with the local authorities on a long-term basis to help them reduce their impact and build their sustainable cities.
Billy?
I very much agree with Henri about the partnership. But as we sit here advocating for the role of cities, we have to take a step back and actually look at the reality. And the reality, they talk when I'm talking. The reality is somewhat different. We're saying cities must do this and cities should do that. In those parts of the world where urbanization is moving most quickly, where urban poverty is deepest, the situation is most national governments are not in partnership with their local authorities. On the contrary, most national governments review local government as an inferior form of government. Action is at the top, it's leftovers at the bottom. Most local governments don't have the constitutional, fiscal, or legal authority to do what we say they must do. And so getting cities right is not just an exchange of warm feelings at conferences, it's going to require a complete change in the way that national governments look at local governments, and turning them into the partners is in fact the first challenge.
The Deputy Mayor of Shimla, go ahead. Is that a warm feeling at a conference?
I think, yeah.
Well, we have a warm feeling at a conference.
I just need to qualify that. And also try to make my point. Especially in South Asia, how this urbanization is taking place, especially in a country like India. It's what precedes urbanization. It's not industrialization that is preceding urbanization. Actually, it's sprawling, it's sprawls that are being generated in the name of urbanization in South Asia. And why that is happening? Because there's distress in the peasantry. So now, because of the neoliberal paradigm of governance, the government is actually the state, the major sector, the major actor. The state is withdrawing. And because of the withdrawal, you can't believe that in a nation like India, we have had more than 300,000 suicides by farmers. So actually, it is this sprawl, it is this migration from the peasantry to the urban areas that is taking place. It's an extremely unsustainable model, that's one. Number two is, because I said it's a neoliberal paradigm, which means that urban centers have become centers of exploitation. Take for example, my city, I can tell you, huge money is being generated through n number of taxes. So it's not that people are, so it's more of appropriation of wealth that is taking place in urban centers. Phenomenal appropriation of wealth. And the Gini coefficient very classically tells you that. So on the one hand, movement of urbanization in South Asia, I mean, it's the sprawls that are being generated, it is because of, it's not that it's industrialization that it's inviting them. It's because of distress in the peasantry, more than 300,000 suicides. Secondly, urban centers where people pay, and even without paying, with paying, even if they are not able to get the services, that's a different point. At the same time, it's most unsustainable manner in which these urban centers are taking, because there's a stark contradiction. Because who owns the city? The city is owned by the people, and the custodians of that city ownership happens to be the elected government. But what is an elected government? In South Asia especially, it's a third-rate government that you have. They don't have fiscal powers, hardly 5 or 6 functions are there, and I always call myself, when they ask, are you a mayor of a city? No, I say I'm a deputy mayor. But then what is your function? I say I'm the first garbage man of the city, because that's a function which is universal in the city. Apart from that, to have a holistic view of the city, it is still absent. So with those climate change and sustainable development goals, what we're talking about, if we do not understand the sustainability of the city, of the people, and this is what John Claus was talking about, the whole model of sustainability of a city. Actually, we are creating sprawls. It's slums that we are creating, and once we create slums, climate change and adaptability happens to be one of the major issues. And this is what we are presently grappling with. One of the best cities that we have in India, it's Chennai. Chennai is not being able to come out of floods since last maybe 1 month. So it's a serious challenge. But then this challenge also gives us an opportunity, and the opportunity to intervene. And it is through this cooperation and through this bargaining that we mount pressure on our national governments that, hey, look, the city's government have a role to play. The city's government have to play a role. And it is through this that now you're witnessing in Delhi, one of the most polluted city in the world, is coming up with an idea of odd and even cars. In my city, Simla, we've come up with an idea that someone who doesn't, maybe it sounds too elitist, or maybe from a class angle, it sounds too class biased. But we've said those who don't own the parking has no right to buy a car. And slowly we'll move towards where odd and even cars, we move in that direction. So your challenges are immense, because the challenges are beyond your control. And this brings me to the final point of what I intend to say, is what I've always been saying, to be or not to be. And this reminds me of one of the plays of Hamlet, to be or not to be. There's no question of not to be, because you could feel the union in an ethereal world, but not in a real world. So the cities are grappling, cities are in the forefront. Unfortunately, the challenges are immense, and through these challenges, I think we'll get opportunities to intervene.
So I love that we're quoting Shakespeare in a UN Habitat session. I love that. Okay, so chuckling right by me is Ingrid Hoven. She's the Director General of Global Issues, Sector Policies and Programs, the Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development in Germany. I'd love to see your business card. Welcome. Nice to have you. See, as you were coming onto stage and as the Deputy Mayor was talking, Henri was writing a little essay down there. What were you writing? Share it with us. I hope it wasn't his shopping list.
No, I was really picking up the most practical words that my neighbor was telling. I guess we diplomats, we live in a kind of cloud, and sometimes when you hear mayor, and I guess it gives us really a chance to think of what the words we use. Sometimes our words are a bit empty. So when you speak of a parking space, or that our lady there talking about the way she lives in the slums, and the reality of the living in cities, I think. But I understand this difficulty between cities and government. But I think this 2015 agenda, this big event that we have here, is a change of paradigm, because people are seeing, and I think the governments are seeing, even if for political reasons they are afraid of their cities somehow, that they have to move. Otherwise, we will not get to the targets. We will not get to the development targets. We will not get to the climate targets. If the cities are not involved, we will not get there. So getting the cities in the INDCs, as you were saying, getting the relationships going, government and cities together for the same targets, is, of course, and then you have the conditions. Let's move on the conditions. But if the international community can move on the conditions to help them change the laws, change the regulations, build the systems, This is going to be a real change maker, and I am very optimistic that we are today in a mood to change.
Ingrid, when Henri said optimistic, you turned round to me. So I'm wondering if you are too. Lean forward, pick up a microphone. So this is sort of the federal level that you represent on this panel, based in Germany. What do you want to add to what we've talked about so far?
Perhaps a couple of thoughts. I mean, the first one is actually what you have raised, that now 90 organizations or 90 events have taken place on issues of cities, urbanization. So when you look at what has been written by science a couple of years ago, already we were told you have to deal with urbanization. You have to turn urban actually concentrations into a climate-friendly and climate-resilient environment. So this was well known by science, and the beauty is now it has come really to the agenda of those who have to take action. And this is an important step because now we are approaching the Habitat Year. And this is the kickoff here in Paris. And I think we can really use the forthcoming months to shape a strong habitat agenda in favor of communities, local communities and cities. The second point is that certainly what you have raised is on finance. I mean, there is an issue. I mean, unless we have a partnership in place between the national governments and the local communities, it will take us more time really to bring the suitable financial tools to the communities that they need. And there are lots of investment opportunities that makes a lot of sense. Before I came to Paris, actually, I visited a project in Beira, the second largest city in Mozambique. And what we are doing actually in order to increase the resilience against floods and the severe impact of climate change in Beira is actually to increase the sewage system. But it's not only about the infrastructure, but it's also about the people, because we started to plant trees. We started to restore green areas within the city to make the watershed management better. So I think the climate debate can bring a lot to the debate on how urbanization should take place and make it even more people-friendly and more people-centered. And thirdly, I think we have now much more solutions in place in technological terms that can be applied. I mean, I see a lot of front runners. You have named a couple of cities on urbanization, on new mobility.
So Ingrid, so people here are sharing some of your thoughts here, and you say you see a lot of solutions in place. Do you want to name them? Do you want to actually explain, unpack them a little bit for us? Because otherwise, that's just a good sentence.
Look, I mean, the one I've just explained on Beira is one. I mean, to deal with adaptation to climate change. In Bangladesh, we have helped low-lying parts of the cities really to do a replanning and resettlement, but resettlement that is actually in line with other principles and is actually inclusive and asks people how they would like to be find a new home. Third one is on transportation. I mean, we have invested in transportation in a couple of major cities, Medellin, Mexico City, and it turns out that this provides better service also to the poorer segments. It improves income equality in cities if you invest in the right type of mobility within cities.
Nice. So, Mayor Tao, is anybody in Joburg asking you to take climate action? Or do they just want somewhere decent to live? And lower taxes?
Well, I think...
And more facilities?
I think what people ask for is, can you meet our most basic needs? And in many ways, when you city leadership, you have to think about how you deal with people's most basic immediate needs whilst addressing planning a city of the future. So it's not always a situation where you make a decision about how to provide services now without thinking about sustainability, about climate change, about redesigning your city, and reconciling your long-term vision and plans and your own policies that seek to respond to the global agenda with people's most basic needs. In fact, as we were discussing earlier, I read an SMS that I received earlier today that said 148 shacks burnt, 198 people affected. That's a real situation in your city that you have to deal with and you have to respond to. What's the response? We're talking about energy in the future, but it's also about energy for the poor. It's about people that live in slums who, as a result of the energy choices they make, find themselves being vulnerable in the city, and we need to find solutions to that. And we as cities sometimes try and design the solutions for people, when in fact in many instances we have to design the solutions with the people. We have to go into communities and say, these are the possible alternative energy sources. We've allocated resources for the first time in this financial year for energy in informal settlements. But our energy solutions have not always immediately been accepted by people. People have said, we want to talk about what the solutions are, and we need to impart more information about what the options are in the energy continuum so that you give people more choices to be able to make about the energy solutions in informal settlements.
So if I lived in Mamelodi, what choices would I have?
You would
Actually,
have-
that's out of your area, that's Pretoria. So if I live somewhere that's in Joburg, in an informal settlement, I'm leaning in towards you because I've got I've got mic feeding back from the speaker. I wasn't being fresh, sorry, Ingrid. What options would I have?
Well, you would have, amongst others, the most immediate option people think about is electrifying through the grid, but also people are talking about, can we have off-grid solutions? Can we have solar panels that provide energy into the household? Can we have microgrids in our communities? And we need to be able to present this, and when people make choices, those choices would include, how does it help sustain our own community? How is it not a once-off solution in my community? How does it enable us to power energy in such a way that it not only sustains my energy needs, but also other needs in my community?
Wow, that's a lot of contemplating to think about when you're basically just trying to deliver energy to people, reliable and affordable energy, right?
And it could be easier to simply say, well, let's get you onto the grid and life goes on. But in many ways, people are able to make choices about, if I do make different energy choices, these are the opportunities available to me. And in many ways, sustainability is exactly about that. It's about finding co-benefits in our communities where people are able to become beneficiaries of the programs that you're implementing into the long term, as opposed to being once-off beneficiaries to something. When you live in an informal settlement, the reality is there's a possible relocation. There's a relocation to more permanent settlements. But it doesn't change the fact that you need energy in your community. And we have to contend with that, particularly as cities in the global south that have financing challenges. We don't have all the resources at our disposal to deal with everything. So we need to find solutions that are sustainable in the immediate term, but could also be sustained into the future. So you need to design it with a degree of flexibility so that you can be able to get people to move with their energy, so to say.
Louise, one of the things you mentioned to me ahead of this session was governance is really important. And I thought, okay, you're thinking big picture here. Take us into that big picture and why you thought governance was important when we're talking about cities and climate action.
No, I think this is something we're coming to this point. I think several interventions before mentioned the importance of this dialogue between local governments, regional governments, central government. Just to give you an example, when countries think of a building code, and a building code is essential, what we are talking about, in terms of locking in investment solutions and energy solutions and all that, when we're making buildings more effective in the use of energy, we're talking about putting together a building code. And that depends on a dialogue between central governments and local. Central governments regulate many aspects of policy that have a direct implication at the local level of government. If there isn't this dialogue, the central government may not be able to understand what the needs and the conditions are at the local level. That's what we say, call in our jargon, the location-specific challenge of climate change adaptation and mitigation. Another example, since we are talking about governance. Governance is not only vertical, central, regional, local. It's also among local governments or among regional governments. Many countries in the world don't have a metropolitan authority to deal with the problems that are common to central or local governments that are in neighboring areas. Other parts of the world have that. We've worked, just to give a very concrete example, we work with a number of cities in Asia in a program that we call Green Growth in Cities. So take the case of Bangkok. Bangkok has a huge metropolitan area, hugely important in relative to the size of the Thai economy, the share of population living there, and a lot of the problems that Bangkok has in solid waste management, in transport, in water. If you've been there, you see the canals crossing the city and all that. Those are part of the solution of resilience, for instance, low-lying coastal area that is subject to floods and all that. The canals important for clean water, for transport. So all those aspects, and Mayor Tal, you mentioned that, all those, let's say, areas where policy action in one aspect has a very direct implication in another aspect that matters for climate change. And if you don't have, to come back to governance, if you don't have a mechanism to structure that dialogue, to coordinate those policies, each local government is going to start working in isolation. So chances are they are going to be working at cross purposes, and that's not good for any one of us. It's no good for the populations there. So I thought just two examples of what we mean by governance. When we talk about investment, can local governments come up with projects that are marketable, that have the right scale so that banks will finance them, so that markets will be interested in those solutions? Sometimes they don't have it. So scalability is a huge problem that involves governance as well. So just a few examples of what we mean by it very concretely. And those issues are at the root of the problem, really. Sometimes you can have you can have banks being willing to finance a project. You can have a good project. You don't have the right scale. And then governance could solve that. You may not have the appropriate capacity in one jurisdiction. You may have that in another one. So governance would solve them, or will help you solve that problem. So I think there are very concrete, very practical solutions and issues that hide behind a fancy word like governance. It seems very pompous, but it's very, very practical, in fact.
One of the things I've seen Billy talk about is planning, and often planning coming too late. When we're looking at cities and climate action, Billy, are we planning too late?
We're hardly planning at all. And that is the real problem. There's a huge disconnect because we tend to have climate change on this side of the equation and everyday business. And it's bad decisions or no decisions that have been taken at a local level, which have got nothing to do with climate change, which have huge impacts on climate change. For example, most cities are run with very little attention being paid to the needs of the urban poor. Most administrations focus on the elite, the moneyed class, the vote. And so this absence of planning leads to cities growing very poor spatially, people getting dislocated onto the most dangerous land. Absence of provision of energy leads to deforestation. All of these are predictable, avoidable decisions. It's this failure. So we're talking about the partnership from national to local. The partnership that's missing at the local level is the partnership with organizations like Slum Dwellers International, which is a member of the Cities Alliance, along with the World Bank and the French government, for example. And that's the kind of, but these partnerships and dialogues with the local government and private sector are missing. And so future planning, in 25 years or 30 years from now, Africa's urbanization will be largely finished. And so the table will have been set. What's it going to look like? On current plans, it's going to be in climate change terms, it's going to be really bad news. And that is why we need real action now, which doesn't have to cost a fortune, to make sure that the way that our cities function is as spatially efficient as possible. At this point in time, it's not happening.
So people watching this or following this conversation and thinking, COP21 was when I actually got my butt in action. What should my butt be doing right now?
The butt, it depends which butt we're talking about. If we're talking about the national government's butt, it would be rethinking the relationship with cities and believing that you can't run everything from HQ, and that actually having mayors, accountable mayors all over the country, with his and her teams in place is a far more efficient way of sharing the governance than trying to centrally control everything. That would be step one. Turn cities into allies.
Anastasia, pick up the microphone again. Anastasia came with notes. Have we ticked off everything on your list, Anastasia? What else is on your list that you thought was important?
I'm here to present the slum dwellers internationally. And I am here to tell you we have more power in our hands because we can be able to save and help ourselves by loaning. Also, we are able to mobilize ourselves and organize. That is the power we have within ourselves. In our country, or worldwide, we have done the data collection, going house to house and doing the profiling, collecting of data. So in every settlement, we know how many people are there, how many toilets are there, water taps, and those who do not use toilets. So that is the power within ourselves. Also, we have done enumeration. And within that information, it is the platform we use to collaborate with the NGOs or the government, the local government or the national government for help. We cannot do ourselves alone because we in slums, there is need for the professionals to do the work we cannot do. So we create a platform for government and for the NGOs which help us to do the work so towards the betterment of our slum dwellers people. We have done a lot. Also by constructing toilets towards the environment or to change the lifestyle that we have stayed for long. Before, 20 families could use one toilet. Can you imagine in the morning when you make a line or a queue for the toilet? There is another alternative by using frying toilets. So that's what made us to go to the drawing board to construct toilets. And by constructing toilets for the people, also it gives us power by biogas, which we use for lighting, also for the cooking. So before...
Anastasia, hold on a second. I'm just trying to imagine this. So we've got toilets and biogas. So biogas comes from the toilets?
Yes.
So like we're powering our own toilets?
Yes.
Oh, natural energy.
Energy.
Homegrown energy.
Yes.
Wow, okay.
Also we use that, the toilet, we use manure. From the toilet, we get manure to plant vegetables. So we have vegetables.
All right. So manure from the toilets
Yes.
that people are using
Yes.
are growing veggies.
Yes.
So I could be a carrot one day. Right. Use the microphone. Yeah.
In fact, the best manure comes from that toilet.
Really? I'm not so sure. I think the manure in Kenya is much better than the manure in Washington, D.C.
Yes.
No, although there's a lot of manure in Washington, D.C., I have to tell you. But we digress. Go back. This is fascinating. Carry on, Anastasia.
Okay, thank you. Also, we have developed adoption of solar system. Because our people are very poor, we adapted solar using, which is safer, sustainable, and also you can use it when there is no electricity. Because sometimes when people who use electricity, when it rains, like now when there is El Nino, it comes even 1 week without electricity. But those who have adapted of using the solar system, they go along with the rights. And also it is safer for the children. And when they flood, you know when the sockets are below, when the flood comes, it can bring disaster. But the solar, by using solar panel, it is safer and sustainable.
All right. I feel like I've been in a fantastic advert. Thank you, Anastasia. I really appreciate that. All right, so we're going to share the conversation out here. Be careful about the microphone. I think I might want to get you to come to us because I don't want anyone to fall over.
Mm-hmm.
because that's not really sustainable for our legal fees. All right, so here is the microphone. Come to the microphone, or we'll try and get it as far back as we can. Yes?
Yeah, Herbert Girodet from the World Future Council and Club of Rome. I just want to ask whether or not a conference on climate change and a meeting on urbanization are a contradiction in terms. We've just heard the figure of something like 85% of people moving to cities or living in cities by the end of the century. Now, it is well known that in Europe and America, cities often make efficient use of energy relative to low-density communities in rural areas. But when you look at developing countries, typically the resource consumption of people moving from the village to the city goes up about fourfold. And more often than not, that is fossil fuel energy. So if we are serious about not going above 2 degrees centigrade, can we not possibly find ways of doing this without actually urbanization as the main continuing goal of human society?
Let's get the two mayors to answer this. Yes.
Not because I'm a mayor of a city, but because this also comes from a third world perspective, from what you call the developing world. I think it's very important what you've raised is because urbanization is bound to happen. And if I go through the India's INDCs, probably we are targeting by 2030 we'll have 40% population urbanized in my country. So which is a serious challenge. And that's what sir, you were saying, there's a disconnect between the national government because it's after all capitalism. It's a system of capitalism that survives. Capital will still survive if you move from fossil fuels to electric cars. The tragedy is who will take the call? If BM Motors, or for that matter GM whatever motors are there, they manufacture diesel cars, why can't the system force them to manufacture electric cars? So that's the whole point. So because the whole system is designed in such a manner, and though we have several missions, but then that through that argument you cannot deny the carbon space that with the very low carbon footprint third world nations individuals have, because they also have the right to life, and they also have the right to decent life. Some people 50 years ago have used fossil fuels, and now they have. So that is the whole point. So in third world nations, what is required is a paradigm shift. A shift what we have also come up by 2030 to reduce by 35 to 40%. But that is insufficient. That will never meet the 2 degrees goal. That will never meet the 2 degrees goal. I think it is beyond that what is required. And when we say beyond that, there has to be a national policy. There has to be a strong connect between and large number of the CO2 emissions come from automobile. That is how and what you're saying is absolutely correct. It's not just 4 times, it is more than that. So it's the urban sprawls that are being generated. I think so that is where we have to shift from diesel, petrol, from fossil fuels, what I'm saying, to mobility towards electric. And so I think that is what needs to be done.
Anybody else want to weigh in on that one?
Well, just to say, I mean, I sit on a National Cabinet Subcommittee, one of 2 local government representatives that's looking at the integrated urban development framework for the country. And in the integrated urban development framework, we're developing a chapter dedicated to the urban-rural linkages. But part of that is the acceptance that urbanization, sometimes it's a choice, but sometimes there's forced urbanization. So to the extent that, let's say, the current drought that's affecting rural KwaZulu-Natal in our country forces people to urbanize, we have to contend with that reality and develop mechanisms to mitigate that pressure point. And people are forced into urban centers. But you need to develop, parallel to your urban strategy, a rural strategy that enables people to be able to sustain in the rural areas so that those who want to make the choice to remain there can make that choice. However, the reality is that people go into urban centers for different sets of opportunities. It's the agglomeration effect of being in an urban center, the proximity to opportunity that people go to urban centers for, and we need to accept that as natural progression.
Maybe another point is that population growth is already inside the cities. It is by itself growing in cities without the migration from the rural centers. And in Africa, you have both the autonomous migration inside city, growth of population in cities because of the cities are already big and they are growing by themselves without the migration. And you have also a huge growth in the rural areas with a lot of small towns and a lot of peasants which are also growing as numbers in the rural areas. So I think it is not just migration which is growing the cities, it is also the cities that are growing by themselves. So the second thing is I think that it's in the cities where we're going to find the best solutions, because it's the cities where we have the capacity to bring together science, resources, financial resources, and we haven't spoken enough about the private sector. I think the private sector is an ally, and even if it's sometimes capitalism that you were saying is not going into the right direction, I think we have the exact same side event just there with the business people in the middle of Paris saying exactly the same thing, saying the big corporates, the smaller corporates are all trying to see how they can invest the solutions, and that will first happen in cities probably. So let's get those things moving forward, those partnerships, and integrate the visions. Climate, also one last point, is that climate finance will be a huge tool. Climate finance is going to grow. We must bring this climate finance into the development and sustainable development agenda for our cities. And we must have this vision for a long-term use of finance, which integrates climate and development finance together.
I would really strongly support this point of view. It's in the past we were a little bit reluctant really to deal with cities and urbanization processes in order to avoid to create pull factors. I think this is the theory of the past, quite frankly. Urbanization takes place out of simply a very young population within cities, and in order to avoid really that we lock into infrastructure, energy systems that are not climate friendly nor climate resilient, I think we have to invest now. And again, Ambassador, also the point on the finance issues, fully agree with you. We have the Green Climate Fund. It's now fully resourced. We can use it also for urban development and planning exercises, and we should really place much more emphasis in shaping the right tools within the Green Climate Fund so that also cities and local communities have access to this new source of funding.
Yeah, no, I think this is a point that needs to be stressed. The old way of thinking of urban versus rural is finished. I mean, really, we have to think, we know it's a fact that cities are dynamic. They attract more creative people. They attract, most of the innovation happens in cities. It's a fact. So the point is, how can you make sure that the source of dynamism that we have in urban areas spreads to the peri-urban and to the rural areas in the end? And one key aspect of it is connectivity. Connectivity has to do with transport, and then it ties in with climate change, because greater transport efficiency is a way of boosting connectivity. But connectivity is much more than that. It's about access to the internet, it's about access to services, about access to information, it's about all those framework conditions that allow people living away from cities to benefit from an increasingly networked way of doing things today. So I would say, yes, the challenges differ in more advanced countries, in less advanced countries, but the fact that rural, peri-urban, and urban are spaces that need to be thought of as part of one single thing, I think that's becoming, the way of looking at those policies nowadays, no?
Excellent question. We could have an entire panel session out of that question. I'm going to wrap that one up, though, for now. I know you've got a follow-up, but you don't. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Chair, and it's good to have a professional moderator handling the session.
It's good. I'm sorry that you don't have one today.
I just tried to flatter you, and you refused to. Anyway. I want to pick up on the climate finance point. I'm co-director of something called the African Climate Finance Hub, operating in the space between the supply side and the demand side of climate finance. And I think the point that's been made deserves further scrutiny, because we know that cities are mission critical, but we're concerned about whether they're fit for purpose and whether the Green Climate Fund and other funds are also fit for purpose. So the point really is, are they equipped to provide climate finance directly to cities? Cities have the best projects, they're closer to the ground, and there's scope for innovative partnerships with organizations like Slum Dwellers International. We recently convened a meeting in Johannesburg with Slum Dwellers International and officials from Dar es Salaam, Kampala and Pretoria, and it was a very creative conversation about how you put together a compelling partnership of real ideas that are authentically generated, not just by professionals like us, but by people who are most deeply affected by climate change, to put a proposition to the Green Climate Fund. Now, the question then is to the panel, are cities fit for purpose to access climate finance, and are the climate finance funds fit for purpose in terms of delivering those much needed funds? Thank you.
This would be a good point for me to trail ahead to Wednesday, back here at 4 o'clock, financing low carbon and climate resilient urban projects, Cities Alliance at COP21. That's going to be an hour and a half of that conversation. But let's do a little summary. Who wants to take this one? Fit for purpose, Meta.
Well, are cities fit for purpose? Certainly. I think that many cities are finding innovative solutions to financing climate change. The city of Johannesburg issued a green bond and mobilized private capital to invest on a listed instrument on the stock exchange, and designed this instrument together with the stock exchange where we're able to mobilize private capital to be able to invest in an instrument. And for us, it suggests that cities themselves are able to think of innovative solutions about how to finance these initiatives. Secondly, we're working with the Global Environment Facility on a program that we're implementing through UNEP, where we've raised funding from GEF that would finance the spatial planning and long-term planning policies of the city that enable us to develop a city that's more sustainable, more resilient, more responsive to the current realities. Are the instruments available fit for cities? That's a slightly more difficult question, because I think the reality is that most of the financing mechanisms are not available to cities. In fact, the GEF facility is possibly one of the first instruments, at least we've engaged with as a city, where you can have direct access as a local authority to an instrument. And reality is that if implementation happens at a local level, the international financing regime needs to be defined in a way that enables cities that can implement to be able to implement and gain access to those resources. And I believe that's where your institution comes in, to be able to build those sort of linkages and bridges. And I think we'll need more and more of those institutions that can build the bridges so that cities could be able to take forward the programs that they indeed have committed themselves to. I mean, we've been here for an entire week, and cities have been making pronouncements about what they are doing at a local level, what their appetite is for new programs. All we need is more and more partners in the process of implementation.
Billy and Henry, I noticed you were having a little side conversation, then you both started to write notes, so you both should respond.
I think the general answer to the question is no. Most cities are not fit for purpose for a variety of reasons. Let me just pick two. One I've already mentioned. They don't have the legal authority to do what we think they might be able to do, so they can't actually borrow directly from, so it's all going to be coming through the national government. Secondly, and I think this is maybe more critical, they don't have the absorptive capacity. And so you need the human skills and resources and the ability to manage borrowing large amounts. We brought out a book that looked at the whole challenge of financing African cities, which we co-produced with AFD 4 years ago, and which quantified the amount of money that was needed. The fact that the cash is there is one part of the equation, but the instruments and the ability to access that cash is still missing. And there's still often political tension between the national and the local, and we have seen, for example, the bond of Dakar stopped this very year for reasons that didn't have an awful amount to do with finance.
I was just talking about Dakar as not the right example, unfortunate example, where we had a very excellent financing model, which was not creating any impact on external resources, which was built from domestic resource mobilization with real projects behind. And then, of course, it became a political situation. I think the mayor knows about it, and so that's why.
So I'm just catching up on this. So just give me this like 3-line version of what happened.
Well, because
it sounds awful.
the city of Dakar.
But that's all I
Yes,
understand.
maybe the mayor knows better. Yes.
All right. So what happened in Dakar?
Well, I think I should allow them to deal with what happened. I'll deal with the process.
No, just make it quick and dirty. What happened? Why did this? Basically, I hear a mess up. I just don't understand how it happened and why.
Well, Dakar was about to issue a bond and the process was stopped by national government. Reality, though, is that we as the city of Johannesburg worked with Dakar in the design of their bond. Reality is that they were on the verge of issuing the bond. They were ready to issue a bond and they had the capacity to implement it. So it's not always that the city itself cannot absorb it. Sometimes it is the local political environment that prevents them.
And what was the project that didn't get funded?
Well, they were going to raise a bond in the debt capital markets and they were going to finance their infrastructure investment programs. As I said, I haven't looked at the detail. We were working on the bond design side, but on the verge of implementation, there were national government interventions.
All right, so I've got everybody wanting to jump in here. Billy and then Deputy Mayor. The microphone is always live, so don't tap it again, please, everybody. And then Louise.
Just a quick point, because Joburg and Dakar are bad examples of what I'm talking about, because they do have the absorptive capacity.
All right.
The vast majority of urbanization in Africa will take place in small and medium-sized cities whose names we don't know and don't mention here. And that's where the challenge is going to be. And so possibly we maybe need to look at pooled financing models. It's very unlikely that the third largest city in Burkina Faso is going to go to market.
Okay, so that's the takeaway really, isn't it? Thank you. Louise, what did you want to add?
Well, I think this is financing for investment is a fascinating topic. I think everywhere. I think the one point that was made is that there are countries where there are administrative or fiscal constraints to whether or not local governments can borrow, and if so, how much. So this is one dimension of that. The other one is other mechanisms. Many municipalities are experimenting with land value capture mechanisms that are beyond green bonds or tapping the markets in other ways. Others have different varieties of partnerships with the private sector to finance investment. So we could go on for hours talking about this, but I think one important point there is that even when you have those mechanisms and you have the capacity to do that, let's not forget the very basic sources of finance at the local level. Local taxes, for instance, which are in many cases very often grossly underexploited in many parts of the world. And those are tax bases that can be collected, that can be used, tapped very efficiently at the local level, even before you go to the market and you borrow to finance investment. So I think it is a very rich, very interesting topic that has very different dimensions to it, even before we think about the more sophisticated financial instruments and vehicles.
Access to finance often simply is impeded because there's a lack of institutional capacity and a lack actually of access to technical assistance to elaborate the right projects. So the missing project portfolio is also an issue in many, especially smaller cities and secondary municipalities. And therefore I think that the launch of the new climate facility by the C40 network, this was done last week at the end of the week, and Germany is proud to be a partner in this endeavor, and we are actually co-financing this facility. We hope by doing so that we can provide the technical assistance to municipalities and secondary cities really to shape a project portfolio that can be bundled and can be presented either to multilateral institutions or to the private sector.
All right, these are very substantial questions. You're a really deep, smart audience. No pressure. Where are the rest of the questions? So I know how many I need to fit in. Any more? Okay. All right. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm with the trade union movement in Toronto, Canada. We've been very deeply involved in city issues. I want to go back to the issue of migration, but in the context of the global north cities, where, as in our city, half of us are born outside. And we're facing three crises: the crisis of environment, the crisis of jobs, particularly for newcomer communities, and the crisis of equity around racialization of poverty. We've been trying to grapple with that by taking the big investment in infrastructure, and transit and housing redevelopment, and building in a program that requires a portion of those jobs to go to residents from newcomer communities, employment equity, for instance. And I'm interested in hearing if that's being done in other cities around the world to deal with the social inequalities and income inequalities that are so prevalent in newcomer communities, especially in the global north.
Who wants to take that one? Billy. Sure. Go ahead.
I think this is what exactly I stated in the beginning. This is this whole new paradigm of neoliberal governance that is excruciatingly drawing the wealth from the people, and it's very starkly getting gravitated and concentrated and centralized. And if the urban governance, but then there's a contradiction also, and the contradiction is that the urban governance has to perform. So it is this urban governance which is a kind of, which has to play a role. And this urban governance doesn't just mean the elected people, but it means many non-state actors. And just yesterday we had a meeting with some of the people who are trying to build exactly the same argument what you're saying. And she is one of the presidential candidate for the US. She's saying climate has to be linked with the whole understanding of governance and the whole understanding of income inequalities in our cities. I think that's what.
I think it's a key question. I don't think it's a question for the global north at all. I think the sets of issues that you're grappling with, you've spelt out the environment, jobs, equity, are precisely the same sets of issues that mayors in the global south have to deal with in terms of whether it's rural or urban migration. And because often the policy response is either similar or the same. And it goes back to the key question, which is a belief that you can invest in the host areas to stop people moving. Has never worked anywhere at any time. The investment makes sense if the investment is for an intelligent commercial reason. If you invest to stop people moving, when their judgment is that I'm not safe here and I want to move, one, or the opportunities are there and I'm going to move, people will move. And governments that try to stop people have failed every single time.
I know we're not supposed to mention places at the United Nations because you don't pick countries out, but can you remind us where that happened last? Where the investment was to stop people moving and yet they moved.
The best example I can think of is apartheid South Africa. It used all of its laws, its army, its police force. It arrested 17 million people in a criminalized movement. Apartheid was really an exercise in spatial control, racially based, to try and stop unwanted black people moving to white cities. I grew up in Johannesburg before Parks was, and it was called White by Night. And there was a curfew, no blacks on the street. No one used more force than the South Africans to try and stop. They failed. It's one of the most urbanized countries in Africa.
Can I just share a small anecdote? This is what happened to us when we assumed office some 3 years ago. I won't mention where the fund was coming from, but it was some international funding. One of the precursors of the funding was you privatize your entire water system. That is why we are going to fund. We said, no, we will not allow that to happen. Maybe it happens in the West or maybe in the North, but it was not suitable to our interests, because that was the most inequitable kind of MOU that we would have signed. We're still providing water. We are finding many other interventions and solutions. So I think it is there at the city government level where interventions and solutions have to be sought. And that's why I'm so obsessed with this term called the neoliberal paradigm. This is always focusing, this is always trying to teach you, hey, you don't know how the governance has to be. Take this model. But this model has already failed, that's all.
I love that. Don't put down the microphone yet. What model Deputy Mayor, what model are you working on then? What model? Sorry, Ingrid. What model are you working on then?
I think
if you don't want to use the failed model, what are you
has to
using?
be of more inclusive, sustainable development with greater participatory role of the citizens. Not just the citizens. I mean, this is also an obsolete term. Of the residents. What about the migrants? So of the residents, I mean, citizens way behind. Only then you can move ahead.
I think cities are being called upon to provide leadership in areas where historically they were not required to provide that leadership. In areas of economic development, in areas of building economic infrastructure and enabling that development. I mean, we're finding in our country that many of our cities have taken on the role of rolling out broadband infrastructure, when in fact the rollout of telecommunications infrastructure is not a classical municipal function. The reality is our cities are saying, how do we increase access, reduce cost, and ensure economic efficiency? It's not a historic
But
city
Mr.
function,
Mayor,
but we're
if the
doing it.
government did it without asking you or consulting you or working with you, then you would be as upset with them not asking you because you have the expertise.
Well, we work around what the law says. I mean, when we initiated our broadband initiative in the city of Johannesburg, the regulation was that you could have a private license and you could on-sell excess capacity. So we built the infrastructure for us to be able to use it and on-sell excess infrastructure but the overall objective is creating access, reducing cost, and improving accessibility. It becomes an overall city objective, and you work within what the law says.
Luis, what did you want to add?
I think this last round was fascinating, really, because we are moving towards something that is much closer to well-being, really. We're thinking about policies for climate change, for health, for education, for all different aspects. From a point of view of well-being, where you see, if you're talking about climate change, what does it do for health? If you're talking about urbanization, what does it do for jobs? We've done a series of case studies for places as varied, as different as the state of Morelos in Mexico, region of southern Denmark, for instance, where we're looking at exactly that. What are those local authorities doing to think about the policy challenges that they are facing in ways that allow them to connect to those different objectives, connect to those different performances, look at those different outcomes. Because if you continue to look at those things as separate objectives of policy, you're never going to exploit the synergies that there are. When you mentioned about sanitation and the impact on energy, I mean, that's a synergy that doesn't come to mind, automatically, but it is there, and these are very important ways of dealing with the problems that we are talking about today. At least, I mean, it's well-being for climate change in a way, or for other objectives. No? Yeah.
I would love everybody in this room to go away with a thought from each of you that rings in their minds whenever they think about cities take climate action. For me, I'm trying to imagine a toilet that's actually going to create fuel, and then I can grow veggies after it. I mean, you reminded me why we were here, Anastasia. It's going to be difficult for all of you, but I really want something, not a generic thing, something very special from all of you, so that people remember this session and not the 90 other sessions that have all been held about cities. So this session, what do you want people to remember, Anastasia?
Okay, thank you. What I want you to remember always is that any government or private sectors cannot do better towards climate change without involving the slum dwellers, because we are very many in many countries. Like now we are in 34 countries, and we are so many. So you cannot go to the climate change leaving us behind. We want you to work together towards the betterment of the slum dwellers. Thank you.
In the spirit of the SDGs, leave nobody behind. Ingrid, pick up the microphone. What you should say should be so good it gets an applause line, okay? No pressure.
On my line, what I have in my mind is the following. Cities are really on the move, and they are part of the solution, a big part of the solution. And governments and international organizations should really accelerate action and get behind them.
Louise, you need to get a round of applause. Okay.
It's
A
tough
good one.
competition here now. No, I would say that nobody can afford to work alone. No actor can afford to work alone in this business. No local government, no city can afford to work alone. And working together is hard. We need to find ways of doing it better. And that's about governance.
Mr. Mayor.
I suspect we can't match Anastasia here. So some of the applause is sentimental, so to say. But I think that, I mean, if you think about it and the work that our cities have demonstrated, they've demonstrated the willingness, the capacity, and the intention to implement. Whatever the agreements that take place at COP21 are, our cities have committed themselves to implement. And what we need to find are mechanisms to resource, finance them so that they can upscale the programs that they are implementing. The work is going to go on. The work has been going on with or without a regime. If the regime is there, it just enhances their capacity to implement.
Just 3 points. One, there's a strong dialectics between climate change and livability. So that's one. Number two, what I would like to say is understand, organize, agitate, militate, and achieve both climate change and livability.
I would like to say that this new urban agenda that we are going to celebrate in 1 year's time in Quito must be built on the energy that we have here. This has been, it is not finished, a most extraordinary show of leadership from so many local authority leaders that we have seen in the last 2 and 3, last week almost. And this energy must be there to build a new model of the new city in which we are happy to live and where all our citizens have jobs, are safe, have a vision for their children on a long-term vision. I think this is what we have to build, and we are here to do that. Thank you.
Thank you. If cities of all sizes are going to do what we say they must do, then I think that one of the central challenges is to make local government an attractive career option for new professionals.
I was not expecting that. Okay. Cities Take Climate Action was a UN Habitat Cities Alliance co-production. It also featured your guest lineup here. Hold the applause for a moment, because I want to tell you that at 4 p, back here on Wednesday, will be the climate finance conversation, also with UN Habitat and Cities Alliance. And now, I would like you to applaud so loudly that the Blue Zone are going, what's going on back there at Agora Hall? Ladies and gentlemen, your panel.